We are continuing our morning with Mitchell Gomez. I'm also going to go off script a little bit for Mitchell. Mitchell is the executive director of DanceSafe. He's been working with DanceSafe for many years in the harm reduction space and other policy initiatives. I know Mitchell well from the festival community, and I think I would describe him as a firebrand. Mitchell will speak truth to power, unlike many who may struggle to do that, and having somebody with a voice like Mitchell has is a tremendous resource for us as a community. He will always say it as it is and make sure that what needs to be known, whether it's difficult, whether it's an uncomfortable conversation, it's said with compassion and integrity, but directly, and so that he ensures that his message is understood. It's something that I've really appreciated in knowing Mitchell for a little while, and I'm very excited to hear some more from him. So I present to you Mitchell Gomez.
Oh, that was a really, really touching introduction. Oh. Let's figure this out. Can everyone hear me? Oh, yeah, that's definitely loud. Hey, everyone. Let's try a couple things here. Let's try to make sure everyone can see me. I got my notes on this laptop, so I'm not actually watching YouTube up here. I'm just going to be... Yeah, so, my name is Mitchell. I'm the executive director of DanceSafe. And I always like to start off talking a little bit about myself, and then I'll talk about the org, and then we'll get into the sort of heart of the talk. First and foremost, this is a movement I care about because I'm somebody who gained tremendous personal benefit from psychedelics. I genuinely believe that if I hadn't discovered LSD in my early 20s, that I don't think I would be alive right now. I really, really believe that. I had some sort of very dark experiences when I was in high school that I resolved through psychedelic use. And my interest in this, my passion in this is not related to my job with DanceSafe. It's a pre-existing condition that I get to sort of do as a full-time job now, which is really good evidence that reality is a hologram, that I've like hacked being a drug nerd into a full-time career. And yeah, I'm somebody who's lost friends to substance use and misrepresentation and adulteration. Every part of my passion about this is very personal. And so, yeah, that's just sort of my background, is I'm somebody who, I am who I am in large part because of psychedelics. And so I really am very lucky that I get to be open about that and be public about that. And I've talked about my own MDMA use on Fox News. It's like a very weird situation, but yeah, I get to be a sort of very open person as who I am and get to do this full time. I also haven't flown in 4 years without a TSA search bag notice. So, how open you want to be about your own substance use is up to you. I'm just letting you know there's double-edged swords on all of this. DanceSafe is a 501c3 nonprofit. We're a health education, harm reduction nonprofit. Wait. That's too close. Hold on. We'll find the sweet spot. Is that better? So we're a health education harm reduction nonprofit. Within the broader harm reduction community, which I'll talk about in a minute, a lot of the money, a lot of the energy, a lot of the time flows towards opioid use, which is fair. More people have died from opiate use since the start of this conference than have died from MDMA use since the invention of MDMA, right? So it makes sense where the money flows. But the issue is that non-problematic substance users, what used to be called recreational substance users, are a massively underserved population when it comes to harm reduction. So I want to talk really quickly about a lot of what DanceSafe does, but I want to start off with just this idea of harm reduction. There's as many definitions of harm reduction as there are people involved in the harm reduction movement. This is the one that resonates with me really personally, because it really is this idea that substance users don't lose their human rights because they're substance users, right? This is a social justice movement. And to me, the fight for cognitive liberty, I actually think, is the next great sort of social justice fight. I think that the right to control our own minds and control our own bodies is fundamental to our humanity. I think that this is an absolute, unequivocal, inalienable human right to control our own minds and control our own bodies, and it has to be framed that way. We have to frame this as the drug war is as great a violation of our civil rights as the sort of anti-miscegenation laws, as the laws that kept women from voting. These are core human rights that are being violated by the war on drugs. And the harm reduction movement has to push that message. We have to push that out into the public, that this is not about people who just want to get high. This is about our right to control our own minds and bodies. So in addition to our core harm reduction work, and I'll talk really deeply about what we actually do on sort of a practical level, a lot of what we do is also focused around education. A tremendous amount of the drug war budget is not actually allocated towards fighting the drug war. It's allocated towards what the government calls drug education, but what is literally drug propaganda. There has been a lot of research that's shown that anti-drug television commercials like this have literally no impact on substance use. There's zero impact. But what these things do is they frame the public debate in a certain way. That's all it is. It's the definition of propaganda, right? It doesn't change the problem. It just frames the conversation. And a lot of what DanceSafe does is trying to sort of counter this demonstrably false drug propaganda that the government pumps out to the tune of several $billion a year. Probably most people my age don't own television, so we don't get hit with this stuff as much. Eventually, the DEA is going to figure out that we're all on Netflix and we'll start seeing it again. But for right now, we get a little break. But yeah, these commercials are back on the air. We're back in the era of just say no. And so a lot of it is countering this false and honestly dangerous narrative that the government publishes. A big part of what we do deals with MDMA use. The government continually calls MDMA deaths at festivals MDMA overdoses. These deaths are virtually never due to somebody taking too much real MDMA. That's almost never what happens. It does happen sometimes. It's not a zero number in the column, particularly in the UK, where they now have pills that are pressed at like 300 to 400 milligrams of real MDMA. MDMA overdoses are actually becoming a thing, but it's generally environmental. It's people taking MDMA in environments that are really hot, don't provide adequate water, don't have any shade. MDMA impacts your ability to thermoregulate. It's a total non-issue if you're sitting on a couch with your therapist. It becomes a real issue if you're dancing for 6 straight hours. But by calling these MDMA overdoses, they push this message to kids that, oh, if I just don't take too much MDMA, I'll be okay. But that's not what's killing people. People are taking what we would consider sort of typical recreational doses, dancing for 6 hours, having hyperthermia deaths, and dying. And so the information that the government is pushing is not just false, it's dangerous. It's teaching people the wrong messages about psychedelics, about MDMA, about all these things. And they know it's false. I talk to people within the government all the time. I'm part of groups that deal with new psychoactive substance threats. Often these groups are run out of universities, but there's chemists from the DEA, CIA agents. I get into these webinars where they talk about new drugs that are coming out. They know the information is false. It's about pushing an ideological prohibitionist narrative that if you just don't take any drugs, none of these risks apply, which is true. In the same way that saying, oh, just like, let's not provide condoms because if kids just don't have any, if we just teach them not to have sex, they won't have STIs. It's like, well, yeah, that's true, but like, it also just doesn't work, right? And Professor Siegel has proved, I think pretty definitively, that the psychological drive to alter our consciousness is as deeply ingrained as the psychological drive toward sex. It's a sort of fundamental part of the human nature to try to alter our consciousness. There's not a person in this audience who didn't spin around really fast as a kid. As soon as they figured out that made you feel funny, right? It's just a thing we do. We have this really innate desire to do it. And so, yeah. And the other thing we've been trying to sort of push as an organization is the idea not just of harm reduction, but of benefit maximization. The real issue is that drugs provide benefit, right? And so that's shouldn't be a controversial statement, but it shockingly is. And so if we accept that everyone is a sovereign of their own bodies and minds, we are the sole ruler of the country that makes up our body, we are the ones who control the borders, we are the ones who make the decisions, I would never tell a person to take a substance. I would also never tell a person not to take a substance. But if a person is going to take substances, I think that we have an obligation to educate them about how to get the most benefit at the least risk out of that substance use. It's far more controversial than harm reduction. Like the idea of benefit maximization is one that is politically risky. It's also one that I think is fundamentally true, that if we teach people how to maximize the benefits of their substance use, we lower the risk of them having any sort of problems. We increase the possibility of them actually gaining benefit from that use. And so, yeah, I think that this is the message, is that yes, substances do provide benefits. We should be open about that. And also, like, we're approaching the point with MDMA where that's just going to be a statement of fact, because once you're through phase 3 trials and it's an FDA-approved medication, that's literally what that means, right? The government agrees that the drug provides a benefit. And so, like, that's the end of that conversation as far as I'm concerned. So this is a really interesting talk. I've never actually done a talk. I think it was Ben who maybe pitched the idea of this talk. He really wanted me to talk about Burning Man. He really wanted me to talk about the psychedelic revolution. I generally just talk about harm reduction. Like when I have a speaker, I generally just talk about harm reduction. I talk about the psychedelic revolution about as often as I breathe. But I've never tried to actually do a talk on this. And so the image came up really low. So that's a shame. So that image says, it's a guy in a suit, and it says, the ayahuasca is a cruel mistress. It changed me forever. And then all the little things are like, Bitcoin for the homeless, and like all these sort of like nonsensical, right? Oh, I'm really sad that image didn't upload right, but that's all right. It probably means the rest of my images are going to be wonky too. I don't know if any of you guys know T Fairy. She's an incredible psychedelic author. She writes for Erowid. T Fairy thinks that more people are taking psychedelics each weekend now than took psychedelics the entire summer of love. I did some rough math based on the DEA's estimates of how many people are taking psychedelics, which I think are massive understatements. They literally get these numbers by doing phone surveys. So they call your house and they're like, "Hi, we're from the government. Has anyone taken LSD in the last year?" So the idea that they're getting an accurate read is sort of nonsensical. But even using the DEA's numbers, I think she's right. I think more people are using psychedelics every weekend right now than used psychedelics during the entire summer of love in the 1960s in San Francisco. This is a massive movement. We are talking about the most widespread psychedelic integration of Western culture since Alaric, the king of the Visigoths, destroyed the Eleusinian mystery temples. Right, so we've had a several thousand-year hiatus on sort of integrated psychedelic use in Western culture, and we're back in the heart of it now. But it's distributed, it's underground, it's very quiet. And so, yeah, it's a really unusual situation that we find ourselves in. This isn't a counterculture. This is a mainstream culture, right? I mean, we have people talking about, we have people talking about microdosing. We have all of these things, right? I seem to be missing my next slide. It's okay. I can do this. I can work on the fly. This is culture, and even if culture is not your friend, we have to accept that this is part of the mainstream culture now. We have Michael Pollan talking about 5-MeO-DMT on Colbert Report. We have Mike Tyson talking about 5 in ESPN, like literally talking about smoking toad venom on ESPN Live. Like, I mean, like that, I really had a hard time processing that. I was like, well, like Mike Tyson, right? Openly saying that he never wants to punch another person again because he now recognizes that we're all fundamentally the same thing. We are one person, right? Underneath all of our sort of ego structure and all of that, there's a core of humanity that is shared across all of humanity, and he never wants to hurt another person. For a person like Mike Tyson to get that lesson from 5-MeO-DMT is a real testament to the power of the substance, right? Paul Stamets went on Joe Rogan talking about I don't think his intention was to talk about psilocybin as much as he did, but Joe is constantly like steering the conversation back towards psilocybin. 5 million views as of the last time I looked at it. This is a conversation that is happening around dining room tables in rural Kentucky. This is a conversation that's happening in prisons. It's a conversation that's happening in boardrooms. It's part of the mainstream. And what that means for all of us is, I think, an ongoing question, because in the 1960s, it really was framed as a counterculture. And Rick Doblin talks a lot about how he thinks that was a mistake. It was a mistake to treat it as like something that was counter to the mainstream. Because as long as you frame your own sort of movement as something that is going against the mainstream, there's going to be massive pushback, right? You framed it that way. You framed it as a thing that's trying to take down culture. We're not trying to take down culture. We're trying to create a better version. We're trying to move things in the right direction. And so hopefully we have that going in the right direction. And a big part, I don't know, I have no clocks. Oh, I have a clock down here. All right, perfect. Wow, I'm going really quickly. This is great. I'm going to get to talk a lot about the sort of core stuff I want to talk about. I know Ben and Coy and most of these folks through Burning Man. It's a massive sort of part of the psychedelic culture, even though the Burning Man org would hate me saying that so publicly. But one of the most interesting things that I realized a couple years ago is that in any definition where you remove the word drug of psychedelic, Burning Man is a psychedelic, right? You don't necessarily have to have drug-induced psychedelic experiences. Albert Hoffman actually talked quite a lot about how he had sort of what he called spontaneous mystical experiences in his youth that he recognized after discovering LSD as like psychedelic experiences. If you read the description of his first time that he supposedly accidentally ingested LSD, it doesn't actually sound like he ingested LSD. It sounds like it was a spontaneous experience that just happened to happen while he was working with LSD. He says it lasted about 2.5 hours. He was a very sort of meticulous German chemist, the German-trained chemist. The idea that he somehow accidentally ingested LSD doesn't really seem to fly with sort of the protocols for running a chemistry lab when you're dealing with totally unknown microgram active drugs. And so it may have been that, not Bicycle Day. On Bicycle Day, he intentionally took LSD. But the few weeks before, when he thinks he accidentally ingested it, that might have just been a spontaneous experience that happened to him. Or the whole story is a cover for something else, which is also very, very possible. And so, yeah, this idea of Burning Man as a psychedelic, something that, profound series of intense sensory perceptions that change your life. I mean, that's a very accurate description of everyone's first time at Burning Man. Like, I don't know anyone who's ever gone there and just like walked away from it the same person that they were when they went in. And so, yeah, it's an unusual confluence because Burning Man is also the place where the work is happening. So this is Burning Man 2008. It was my first time going to the Burn. Rick invited me to come out. I met him at New College. I'm a New College alum as well. I had been going to regional burns. I had heard people talk about Burning Man. I was not fully prepared for we got there at night. I set up my tent, woke up in the morning. I was going to try to find Rick Doblin. Of course, he's in the tent right next to me because that's how Burning Man works, right? We get up and we're walking around camp and I come around the corner and John Perry Barlow, Alex and Allison Gray, Sasha and Ann Shulgin, and Dennis McKenna are standing there talking, right? It's just what's happening? And so, it's the place where the work is happening. Zendo is very much an outgrowth of Burning Man. They work a lot of other events also. But if you want to get involved in psychedelic research and you want to talk to the people in a non-sort of conference setting, there's one place to do it. And it's not that hard. It's, it's hard. Burning Man's really hard, but it's not that hard to, make the thing happen. But on the flip side of that, it's also a not entirely comfortable relationship with the people who sort of help throw the event. So that's Larry Harvey, founder of Burning Man, very, very famous for always wearing a white cowboy hat. The only picture I have of it with him before he passed away, he happened to be wearing a DEA hat. It works so well. I mean, it's just so lovely that that's the one picture I got with him before he passed away. Burning Man as an organization is not entirely comfortable with harm reduction. They're not entirely comfortable with substance use. They're certainly not comfortable with DanceSafe. They're really sort of on the fence about how we operate out there. We don't have an official presence at Burning Man. We operate in a very underground, very quiet way. They make a lot of claims about why they're uncomfortable with it. Burning Man is one of the very few events that happens anywhere in the world where there actually is a specific line in the permit they can point to as a reason why they can't allow DanceSafe to operate. So the BLM closure permit for Burning Man copies the Nevada paraphernalia statute. There is no federal paraphernalia law, so they copy the Nevada law. And in Nevada, the testing kits that we use for testing people's substances are technically drug paraphernalia. No one's ever been arrested for them. We send them to Nevada all the time. We sell them just outside of Burning Man at a booth. I have no concerns about being arrested. The political optics of these people are trying to stop fentanyl deaths, so we arrested them, are so horrendous that I no longer have any concerns about the paraphernalia laws. But there is actually a line in the BLM permit that Burning Man can say, this is why we can't allow DanceSafe. And they're the only event I'm aware of that has that. And so, it's an uncomfortable relationship. But they know who I am. They know I'm there. I swing by First Camp every year. I actually worked for Burning Man before I worked for DanceSafe. And so, I know the Burning Man org very, very well. They have no issues with me being there, but there's a very sort of wink and a nod relationship when it comes to letting us operate. So I've worked for Burning Man and DanceSafe, and so if I can get a job someday with Meow Wolf, I'll have hit the hippie trifecta. So I need to, after I retire from DanceSafe and end the drug war, I think I'm going to try to go do that. So how this all ties together. I didn't have a good image for how things tie together until I thought of this is a picture of a normal spider web and then a spider that has been given LSD. And so I don't know if you guys know about this study, but we actually gave spiders drugs. They would actually dose the flies, right? So you put a little bit of LSD on a fly, and then you like put it in the spider web, and the spider will eat it. They did it with LSD, mescaline, psilocybin. Most of the webs are a hot mess. The LSD web I actually find really elegant and beautiful, and I think that's a really interesting idea. I think that every big problem that society is facing right now, the sort of collapse of the collapse of industry in this country, the ecological destruction of the planet, the sort of inevitable realities of late-stage capitalism are all tied together by a single factor. What we have in the world is not a resource deficit. What we have in the world is an empathy deficit. And I genuinely believe this. I really, really do. And psychedelics, empathogens, a lot of people have problems calling MDMA a psychedelic. I actually think it qualifies perfectly well, especially if you hit the dose just high enough. These drugs, properly framed, if they're really the drug you think they are, taken in a proper context, provided with the right... It's not just the drug, right? The drug alone is not a panacea. There was a group of CIA officers who used LSD to come up with more creative bombing patterns for Vietnam. And so, like, it's not just the substances. But properly framed, these drugs really reliably increase our ability to feel empathy for other human beings. And I think if we can figure out how to integrate that experience within our culture, we can fix a lot of these problems. I always used to think it was just a matter of, like, showing the right people the right problems. If we can just show them the problem, we can fix it. My wife and I spent 6 months in India a couple years ago. In Mumbai, there's a building called Antilia. It's the largest, most expensive private home ever built on Earth. It was built at a cost of $1.3 billion. And it directly overlooks the Dharavi slums. So the person who lives in the most expensive home on Earth literally looks down onto the largest slum in India. And so that was my waking up moment of like, oh, like it doesn't matter if you show the right people the right problems. You have to show the right people the right problems in the right state of mind. Right, that's really important. And so, I think that figuring out how to integrate these psychedelics into our culture can fix almost all the big problems we have. But that doesn't just mean the medicalization of psychedelics. I think that we really need to be talking about the sort of, again, not just fixing problems, but benefit maximization. We need to recognize that even people who don't have a DSM criteria mental illness, we live in a profoundly unwell society. And all of us have integrated those experiences. All of us have internalized the sort of sickness that is inherent in the Western experiment, whatever you want to call this. And the way that we do that, the way that we provide people these tools is through harm reduction. I think we're a long way away from like legal MDMA at 7-Eleven, where a non DSM criteria person can go in and experience these substances. And even if we did get to a point where people could take these things in a medical context for non-medical reasons, that still doesn't fix the fact that there's a lot of people who don't have access to medical care. There's a lot of people who don't have the resources to access these things. And so people are going to be continually seeking these substances on the black market. This is DanceSafe's core mission, is teaching people how to do drugs safely. Have you guys ever seen the meme that says badly describe your profession? Have you ever seen that meme that goes around? So the way I always badly describe my profession is I help people make better bad choices. I actually don't think they're bad choices, so it's a bad description, but that's what they asked for, so I'm doing it, right? So this is sort of a typical DanceSafe setup at an event. We provide drug information, condoms, earplugs, safer snorting implements. You can actually spread hepatitis through sharing dollar bills or keys. And so we used to do big bowls of blacklight reactive cut straws with a blacklight over them. Promoters often were not a fan of that setup. So now we have printed information on organic hemp business cards about hepatitis C, and it's perforated, so it tears very easily into 3 individual snorting straws. That works much better. That was actually a non-sober Mitchell revelation. That was so non-sober Mitchell helped out sober Mitchell. I love when he does that because that guy can be a real jerk. So it's nice when he's not a jerk. This is a lot of what we do. But the sort of main service, the thing that gets me on the news, is we do on-site drug checking services. So this is drug checking, not drug testing. Nobody is peeing in a cup in the DanceSafe booth. People bring us the substances they're planning on consuming. We chemically analyze them to determine the primary composition. And then regardless of whether it's what they thought it was or not, there's an educational component. Because even if your drugs are actually MDMA, if you take them when it's too hot, if you take too much, if you don't drink enough water, if you drink too much water, if you're too active, there are still very real health risks to MDMA that can be potentiated through environmental conditions. And so it's a sort of door to start talking to people about their substance use who are never going to go talk to somebody who's like a drug counselor, right? Because they don't need that. Most of these people are non-problematic users. They don't meet the DSM criteria for problematic substance use. They're maybe using MDMA 3 or 4 times a year. These are not people who need to talk to a drug counselor, but there's still people who probably need some education about the risks of the substances they're taking. And so, yeah, the first, last, and only black market that most people ever interact with is the drug market. And we live in a society that is far more regulated than most of you realize. Well, maybe not most of you, because a lot of you are involved in the medical research, so you know how regulated the world is. Most people don't realize the back-end regulation that goes into everything in this country. When you go buy a bag of chips at a store, if there's something wrong with that bag of chips, they can scan the barcode and they know who transported it. They know what store it was sold at, who transported it to that store, which facility it was manufactured at, who was working on the line when the chips were manufactured, where the plastic was made that went into the bag, where the corn was grown that got turned into the chips. I mean, all of that is knowable information. Drug markets don't work that way. And so there's a lot of misrepresentation, a lot of adulteration. We've had years in this country where 70% of the ecstasy that we tested was not MDMA. 70%. That's actually gotten better. That was a couple of years ago before some changes in the market. But yeah, misrepresentation is a direct outgrowth of prohibition. When you get MDMA hydrochloride that's produced at the University of Bern in Switzerland, you know with 100% certainty that that is MDMA. Very few of us have access to that jar. In this crowd, weirdly, it's not a zero number, but very few of us have access to these sorts of drugs. And so, yeah, it's just a sort of continual ongoing problem. And it's a really, really, really frightening one. As Sarah said, these are not your grandma's drugs, although there's lots of grandmas out there now who might be trying to find them, so they're becoming your grandma's drugs. But yeah, the drug markets are controlled by criminals, right? By definition. I don't have any judgment on those people's criminal behavior. I actually deeply respect some of those criminals' behavior. But the reality is these are black markets. There's no regulation. There's no control. And really the best trick the prohibitionists ever pulled on our society was convincing us to call drug prohibition drug control. I mean, what a clever culture hack. Drug control is what I described with chips, right? Drug control is that when you buy a beer at a store that says it's 3.1% alcohol, you know with 100% certainty that it's 3.1% alcohol. That's drug control. Drug prohibition is the abdication of drug control to the black market. It's giving all of the control to the criminal gangs. That's not drug control, but boy, they won that linguistic argument in a very impressive way. So we do a lot of different types of drug testing. Did I miss a slide here? No, I did not. Okay, perfect. So we originally started and continue to fund ecstasydata.org. They actually recently purchased drugdata.org, and that website now forwards to ecstasy data. It's currently managed by Earth and Fire from Erowid, which is simply wonderful because it takes it all off of my plate and DanceSafe's plate, and they've managed it for quite a long time now, but we continue to fund it on the back end. This is done by a lab called DDL, Drug Detection Laboratories, is the sort of underlying architecture of ecstasy data. They are a DEA licensed crime lab. So they test drugs for police, they test drugs for the DEA, they have a Schedule I receiving license. And you can mail them drugs. They will test the drugs and then put them on the website with the code that you submitted the drugs with. The DEA started allowing this in the 1970s as a way of like figuring out what was in the drug supply. They wanted that data as well. And so Emmanuel, who started DanceSafe, found this lab that was doing it. At the time, you had to mail them the drugs and then call a voicemail box and type in the code you had submitted it with, and you alone got that information. So he convinced the drug detection laboratory to let him buy a website, set it up. We'll submit the drugs. It was actually harmreduction.net was the website, which he has since given to the Harm Reduction Coalition. You could mail them the drugs, and they would put the code on the website so that everybody would have access to that data. Because with baggies of heroin, which was why the DEA originally allowed this, it wasn't particularly useful for everyone to have that data, right? Stamps are just stamps, they make sense. With pressed pills, you can start to see trends. And so he really wanted to see those trends. And so, yeah, the lab is still operational. Just ecstasydata.org. It's a GCMS lab, state crime level. By the terms of their DEA license, they are not allowed to provide quantitative data. So they cannot tell you how many milligrams of MDMA are in a pill. The DEA claims that drug dealers would use this as an advertising source, like, look how strong my pills are. They might be right. Even if they're right, that's bullshit that they don't allow it, right? Even if they're right, that's still the wrong decision to make from the right data. Because we have a right to know what we're putting in our bodies, even if what we're putting in our bodies is illegal. And so, yeah, they're not allowed to do that. But there are labs in Europe that you can mail drugs to. Energy Control is a lab that is in Spain, and they will tell you how many milligrams of MDMA are in your pill. And we're also working with a group called The Loop in the UK that I'll show you to develop an at-home method of washing out all of cutting agents from a pill of MDMA. So we're hopeful that we'll have all of that. The Loop has really been taking point on this, but we're going to, the final steps, we're going to help them with like the messaging and figuring out how to publish this information. And our hope is to have that done this year so that anyone who has a pressed pill of MDMA can wash everything out and know how many milligrams of MDMA are in that pill. So this is The Loop operating in the UK. They are operating with permission from the government, so they get to do things like this at a festival. You know, you put up a giant sign, it says drug testing. They have an FTIR lab on site. They actually own a few FTIRs, which is a Fourier transformer infrared spectroscopy machine. It basically fires a series of infrared laser beams through the drug sample. Every molecule in the world absorbs infrared light at slightly different spectra. And so by examining the spectrum that the light is being refracted through the drug at, you can get a really good idea of what's in it, including any cutting agent over 5%. So if it's 80% MDMA and 20% methamphetamine, the machine can actually tell you that. DanceSafe has one that we've been borrowing from a university I'm not allowed to name. We've had it at about 15 events so far in the last 2 years. It's an incredible piece of technology. It works really, really well, and I'm not allowed to talk about it on the internet because we're borrowing it from a university. So we're in the process of raising the money. It's looking really good because of Burning Man. It's looking really good that we're going to have one in the next few months. So as soon as we have one, we'll start putting the videos on the internet of us using this thing. It's a sexy machine. It's really, really fun. So I'm really hopeful that we'll have one soon. This is primarily what we do. This is reagent testing. So reagents were generally developed by law enforcement as a way of detecting like roadside identification of substances, right? So they find a big baggie of white powder and they want to know what to arrest you for. A lot of you have probably heard about the false positives that happen with these police tests. They're using the same underlying technology, but the methodology they use to sort of read these tests is designed for false positives. I would testify to that under oath, like if I was in a court trial. They are using them to manufacture probable cause. That's all it is. And so the tests work fine if you know how to read them and you know how to use them. They intentionally use them in a way that will give you false positives on a lot of things, including manufacturing individual reagents that I know are nonsense. There's a reagent called the modified cobalt reagent. It's sold to law enforcement all over the country as a cocaine test kit. Cocaine's a little difficult to reagent test with our existing tests, so I was really excited when this reagent was released by a law enforcement supply company. We manufactured some ourselves, and everything I put in it reacted the same as cocaine, including dirt, tree leaves, lint from my pocket, and air. If you crack it and set it on a table and wait about 15 minutes, oh, look at that. Like, it's a positive reaction for cocaine. And so I'm 100% sure that the modified cobalt reagent is designed to allow them to search cars. That's all it is. Because the reality is if they pull over an older middle-class white guy in a Benz, they're not going to test the tree leaves that are like sitting on his floorboard. If they pull over somebody that they really want to search, they can just test anything and it'll turn blue, and then they can search you legally. This is legal. But the reagent tests work really well. You scrape off a little sample of the pill, you run multiple reagents, which is the main difference between what we do and what the police do, is that it's not a single test. You run multiple tests to confirm what you're getting. You compare the colors that it changes to a known color chart. And this is a presumptive identification of the primary composition. So it's not saying for sure that it's MDMA. You can say for sure this is not MDMA. If any of the colors are wrong, this is something else. If all of the colors are right, you can have a really good idea that it's probably MDMA, but it's not positive identification, which is why we want the FTIR. The FTIR is if the spectrum matches, it's MDMA. There's no question. This is actually the same technology they use to, or one of the technologies they use to figure out the composition of atmospheres on other planets. As infrared light passes through the atmosphere, it'll go through molecules of water, and based on the FTIR spectrum, you can actually, it's the same technology, which is really neat. Fentanyl, unfortunately, does not reagent. Pure fentanyl, I can reagent test fine. That's not what we're seeing in recreational markets. We're seeing a few milligrams of fentanyl that show up in a baggie of cocaine. If you're a non-opioid user, a few milligrams of fentanyl is enough that you're probably not going to walk away if you snort that line. And so this is a piece of technology that we've helped sort of figure out for testing for fentanyl cut into other drugs. This is the exact same technology that you use for pregnancy tests, but the immunoassay bacterium are engineered for fentanyl metabolites instead of pregnancy hormones. And so, yeah, these are great. These were actually developed to test people's urine to see if there was fentanyl in their urine. So they were being sold to, probation officers, police departments. And we had heard rumors that heroin users were testing their heroin with these fentanyl strips and getting results that were either positive or negative. I was so convinced that this was nonsense that I agreed to organize and fund a study to prove that it didn't work. I was sure this was nonsense. Like, it's looking for fentanyl metabolites. Like, there's no reason this should work. And much to my delight, I was wrong. They actually work really, really well. They actually detect fentanyl at far below a psychoactive dose. So you do occasionally get a positive result for fentanyl, and then the person does the drugs anyway, and they're like, there was no fentanyl in this. That's not really a false positive. There was fentanyl in the sample, but you have to message that very carefully. Otherwise, people start to distrust the test strips. A positive reaction does not mean that it's pure fentanyl. It doesn't mean it's necessarily going to kill you. It doesn't necessarily mean you're going to feel anything. It means there is some amount of fentanyl in the sample. That's what it means. And so, do with that information what you will about your own personal drug consumption. So this is an art project that was done in New York of heroin stamp baggies that the artist found just in her parking lot. And so really, really neat articles. I primarily don't work with opioid users. The fentanyl strips has changed that quite a lot. And so I've had to sort of play catch up with what opioid harm reduction looks like. It's not my core market. I really liked opium when I was younger. Like, just out of high school, I had a connect for opium that I really liked, but that was as much opioids as I've ever done in my life, was actual opium that I was smoking. Heroin users, particularly people who are sort of chaotic use, they meet the DSM criteria for problematic use. If they get a positive result on a baggie that says there's fentanyl in that baggie, they're very unlikely to just go throw it away. They've been hustling to get that bag. A lot of heroin. There's cities now where, particularly in Canada, where every bag you test is positive for fentanyl. And so convincing these people to don't do that baggie is not what the messaging is. The idea is, okay, there is some amount of fentanyl in this baggie. So maybe start a little lower, maybe make sure there's somebody there who's sober, who knows how to use Narcan and has Narcan. Don't use alone. Don't do your full shot. Prepare the shot and then do a test shot. And that messaging alone has really worked to decrease overdose deaths in communities where we've deployed the fentanyl test strips. At festivals, when we're testing people's cocaine, which is where most of the fentanyl shows up that's not in heroin, is cocaine and methamphetamine. I have never tested a baggie of cocaine that was positive for fentanyl that didn't immediately result in the person saying, is there a trash can in the booth? People who are at a festival with a gram of cocaine can afford to go get another gram of cocaine. And so that's generally what the end result is. I've never tested a sample of MDMA that was positive for fentanyl. MDMA actually false positives the strips if you don't dilute it enough. So we figured out a dilution ratio that doesn't false positive for MDMA, but still detects the fentanyl if there's any in there. So you got to read the manual, you got to read the instructions. I've never tested MDMA that was positive for fentanyl when it was diluted properly. We do now have a couple of confirmed cases of people who purchased what they thought was MDMA, took a pill. Their friends swear up and down that was the only substance they took that night, who then died from fentanyl overdoses. We have at least 3 of those cases now, including one that happened just like a few blocks away from the DanceSafe office in Denver. It was somebody who bought a pill in a nightclub. They were told it was MDA. They were told it was SAS. They took the pill. There was actually 3 people who took the pills. All 3 of them, their next coherent memory is waking up in the hospital. All 3 of them were transported to the hospital. 2 of them lived and 1 of them did not. We're still waiting on the autopsy report from the decedent, but one of the other people they ran their own toxicology through a lab and they were positive for fentanyl. It was cocaine adulterated with fentanyl. Yeah, that Pittsburgh, in this area in particular, here to New York, up into Ohio, we have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of confirmed cases of cocaine adulterated with fentanyl killing people. Just as a side note, this wasn't part of my slide, but this is something that I think everybody should know. Starting in 2014, 2015, we started hearing anecdotal reports of people who were getting autopsies. They were people who were found dead. The autopsies were positive for cocaine and fentanyl. And so people started asking, oh, is fentanyl showing up in the cocaine supply? And I was deeply skeptical of the idea that that might happen. There's no like rational drug dealer reason that you would do that. All through 2015, we started hearing more reports. 2016, we started developing the strips, but primarily because the public was so concerned, not because I believed it was actually happening. There are thousands of like fake Xanax, oxycodone. There's fake prescription pills that are pressed with fentanyl. So what I thought was happening is people were doing cocaine. They were taking like what they thought was an oxycodone that actually had fentanyl. That was killing them. And then we were getting the autopsy report. This is what killed Prince, was fake prescriptions that were pressed with fentanyl. This is what killed Tom Petty, was fake prescription drugs that were pressed with fentanyl. We now know that starting in 2015, the Ohio State Crime Lab had 300 samples of cocaine that had been seized that they knew were adulterated with fentanyl, and they refused to release that information. So the police in Ohio knew. They knew 100%. They had the baggies. And it wasn't until years later with a Freedom of Information Act request that they released that information. So like this is the drug war, right? This is the drug war, is the police knew that cocaine adulterated with fentanyl was killing people, and they sat on that information for 3 years until we forced them to release it. So like that's just where we're at. But this is our sort of primary market, is MDMA users. These are all pills that were, the top half mostly came out of Europe. The bottom half were mostly in the US. Europe has a much more refined pill pressing technology available to them. They get really interesting shaped pills. And if you ever, I handle hundreds of these a year because we're testing them. They're just as hard as a pharmaceutical. US pills, you can like, with your finger, you can scrape off enough to test. These European press pills are like pharmaceutical grade MDMA tablets. You need like a really sharp knife you're really like digging into them. Sometimes they're pressed with a UV reactive coating, so they'll glow under black light to make sure that nobody like crushed them up and repressed, like using an identical press. There's a group called the Q-Dance group. They have an Instagram where they post pictures of the next pill they're going to be releasing, so that you can like keep an eye out for the new Q-Dance pills. It's really a professional black market now. The dark web changed everything. It really was a massive change. The problem is that you can copy a pill press, right? And so what happens is a pill is released, it's real high-dose MDMA, it gets a really good reputation. The UPSs in particular, which is the upper corner of this image, it was a UPS logo pill press, really got a reputation. The Teslas really got a reputation. The Teslas were roughly 300 milligrams of like really high purity MDMA and binding agents. There was nothing else in those pills. And so like, there was like an image that went viral that was like, you can only take one pill. It was like, this one makes you invisible. This one gives you the power to fly. This one gives you telepathy. Red Tesla, right? Like, which pill do you pick? And so, they really had. But then what happens is they get the reputation. Somebody makes a pill press. They start pressing out something else. And so even if you know that you have a pill that's been tested, that batch has been tested, you still have to reagent test because there's still misrepresentation that happens. We tested, are the grenades on here? Oh, they are. So 4 rows down on the end, there's those grenade pills. There was a party in Florida about a year and a half ago that I was at where we tested, I believe, 11 grenades, and all 11 were different. There was not 2 that matched. At a single party, same press, 11 different things from 11 different pills that looked, they were visually identical. Some of them were 2CI, some of them were MDMA. One of them was 2CI, one was 2CB, methadone. There's one that I'm sure was just sugar. Like, I'm positive it was just sucrose. And so like, yeah, you just can't trust pills, and you can't, everybody's like, oh, I trust my guy. And it's like, oh, that's great. Like, of course you trust your guy. You're buying drugs from him. Like, nobody goes and buys drugs from somebody they don't trust, right? That's implicit in this situation. It's not about your guy. It's about your guy's guy. And no matter how much you love your guy, 5 up the chain, there's somebody that you would not hang out with. I promise. And so like, it's just, that's where misrepresentation happens. It happens way up the chain. And so you just have to know that like, these are adulterated markets. You have to trust them. This is one of my favorite images I get to use in slides. This was actually sent to me by a friend of mine who was like, you should use this in DanceSafe slides. And you were like, you are correct. I forget where he was. It was somewhere outside the United States where he took this picture. Yeah, so these are Ditos. Misrepresentation is real, it's widespread, and it affects every single drug market that we interact with. The MDMA markets, like I said, we've had years where more than 70% of the MDMA or of the ecstasy was something other than MDMA. That actually changed because of a group of European chemists. So basically, for a long time, MDMA was always produced using saffron oil from the Cambodian rainforest. For a while, MDMA was probably responsible for something like 10% of deforestation. The Cambodia really cracked down on this, not because they cared about international drug markets, but because we were cutting down all their forests. So Cambodia went in, they really cracked down on this, and that's when we had this massive uptick in the substituted cathinones being sold as ecstasy. Drugs like methylone, butylone, ethylone, and ethylpentalone were all being sold as ecstasy. There was a group of European chemists who figured out there was a precursor called PMK glycodate. It's a widely used industrial chemical. The global market for it is like hundreds of thousands of tons a year. The idea of controlling it is like, we're going to crack down on ethanol, right? Like, it's like, no, you're not. And PMK glycodate is closer to that than anything else. This group of European chemists probably could have made $1 billion pumping out real MDMA when everybody else couldn't do it. And instead, they published the recipe as part of like a manifesto of real ecstasy. And so they like published the recipe, they put it out there. It's pretty trivial chemistry. PMK glycodate is a pretty easy to get precursor. And so I think we're going to see a sort of, the market has now shifted back. I would say 80 to 90% of what we test is actually MDMA, and I think that's the new normal, just because it's like a really difficult to control precursor. It's used in like far too many industrial applications, and also legal currently in a handful of countries for anyone to purchase at any quantity. And so there's groups that are going into like, I think either Russia or Ukraine is one of the countries, and you can just go in and be like, I would like 70 metric tons of PMK glycodate, and like hand them briefcases of cash. And the yield is like somewhere in the neighborhood of 30%, like 30% weight comes out the other end as MDMA. And it's cheap. And so the individual price on grams of MDMA in Belgium now, which is where much of the production happens, is right around 15 to 20 euros. That's buying a single gram like in a nightclub. And so the wholesale price on MDMA has crashed. The retail price is coming down to sort of match that. And so, yeah, the MDMA markets, I think we're going to see a permanent sort of balance. LSD is often not LSD now, just because it fits on blotter and makes you hallucinate. That used to be a very small list. It was like, there was LSD, there was LAD, there was DOI, DOB, a handful of others. And most of them were like experientially different enough that somebody who took DOI and is still tripping, 17 hours later knows they didn't take LSD. They're going to go back to their guy and they're going to have a conversation about the fact that they're still tripping 17 hours later, right? There's now a whole family of drugs called the N-bomb family, 2,5-I-N-bomb being sort of the most common. The vast majority of people who take it don't suffer any major negative effects. The vast majority of people who take it have, roughly 8 hours of a psychedelic experience. They come down and they're okay. I've never taken it, but I've been told it's slightly less sort of ontologically disrupting and slightly more visual. That actually sounds kind of desirable, right? Like you're tripping a little less hard, but the visuals are nicer. There's a reason that at a party, people would prefer that. Some percentage of users, we don't know why, we don't know how many because nobody studies this stuff. Some people take 2,5-I-N-bomb and have multiple systemic organ failure deaths. Their bodies just shut down and they die. And these are not people taking massive amounts. We know plenty of cases where people took a single dose of blotter and their organ shut down and they died. As far as we know, nobody who has decompensated, nobody whose medical stuff has started to go south has lived. If it starts to become a problem, it's fatal. And we just don't know why. And so I hate the Russian roulette metaphor. It's the most overused metaphor in the drug world. With 2,5-I-N-bomb, it's a very apt metaphor. It seems to be first-time users who are dying. So I personally suspect this is a metabolic thing. Some people don't process this drug right. We don't know why. We don't know how to test for it. They take it and they die. Ketamine is heavily misrepresented. There's MXE, which is a drug that's sold as ketamine quite often, 3-methoxy-PCP. There's a whole galaxy of PCP analogs that are now legally available in Russia and China and India, so you can just buy them on the internet. You can use your credit card. They'll ship them to your house. USPS is the largest drug dealer in the world, like demonstrably largest drug dealer in the world. And so, yeah, the profit margin on some of this stuff is insane. You can buy a gram of 2,5-I-N-bomb in China for like maybe $1,200. A gram is enough to lay 6,000 doses of what you would call LSD. You know, at $100 a 10 strip at festivals, like you can't make that sort of profit margin as a bank robber. And so there's this massive profit margin that we've created through prohibition. And yeah, people are going to move in and take advantage of that. And with ketamine in particular, for a long time, we thought most of the ketamine that was testing as ketamine was just ketamine, because reagent testing just tells you primary composition. But as we've started to deploy this FTIR, what we have found is that a lot of the ketamine is adulterated with amphetamine analogs that are legal in Russia. So things like 4-FA, 4-fluoroamphetamine, there's a whole family of these amphetamine analogs that are legal in Russia that are being cut into ketamine. And I think it's an intentional attempt to keep people from K-holing, from like falling over anesthetized. Because that's a really bad look, right? If you're selling ketamine in a nightclub and people start falling over, like the guy who owns that nightclub, they're not dumb, right? They can turn a blind eye to people, but if you start knocking people over in their club, like things are gonna happen. And so I think they're trying to basically design a dissociative psychedelic that won't put you over. You stay up, you're still moving, you're cognitive, or you're cognizant of what's going on around you. And so we even had somebody come to we did a private testing party in New York for some stratospherically wealthy dudes who would not go to would not come to a DanceSafe booth in public, sign non-disclosures, the whole thing. It was really a lot of fun. And one of them had a baggie that was labeled "My Favorite Ketamine-ish." So he knew there was something else going on. He knew it wasn't ketamine. And so, yeah, it was, so we got to do that. So we've actually played this game before. In the last year of alcohol prohibition, about 30,000 Americans were either killed or hospitalized because the government would poison methanol, industrial methanol, so that it couldn't be diverted into the black market. It would get diverted anyway. People would drink it. They would go blind. They would die. You outlaw a popular drug, create a black market, drive up the price. It also drives people to more powerful versions of that drug. Under alcohol prohibition, it was almost impossible to get beer in this country. Everybody was drinking whiskey because you get more doses per smuggled volume, which is exactly what's happening with fentanyl now, right? Fentanyl is less euphoric than heroin. It's less desirable than heroin, but it's easier to smuggle. That's it. That's the only thing it has going for it. It's easier to move from point A to point B. And so we've done this, and we know how to fix it. We just legalize and regulate the drugs. Like, that's the answer. It's the solution. We've done the solution before. And in a world with legal regulated heroin, people always say, oh, but don't you think everyone, like, particularly cops often tell me, well, don't you think everyone's just going to start going and doing heroin? Like, aren't you going to do as much heroin as you want? It's like, I currently do as much heroin as I want. Like, I currently do exactly as much heroin as I want, which is 0 heroin. That's how much heroin what are you telling me right now? Like, what are you telling me about your desire to do heroin? like what's happening? And so I do think we would probably see a small uptick in substance use if we legalized all drugs. I do genuinely believe that. There are some people who just don't do it because it's illegal. But if we see like a 3% increase in use and a 95% decrease in deaths, done. Like, I'll take it. I'll take that trade all day long. But, circling back to psychedelics, we really need the new Eleusinian mysteries. We need not just acceptable, legal psychedelic use. We need integrated psychedelic use. We need to integrate the message of psychedelics, which I have genuinely come to believe matches the message when I believe Ram Dass asked Babaji, how should we treat others? Does anyone know what his answer was? There are no others. Right? That's the answer to how we should treat others. And I think that's the message that we can properly frame. But for me, this really is, I love Terrence. I really do. I mean, he went off the edge sometimes. This quote will never stop bothering me. The Constitution was drafted on hemp, but it was written on vellum. So we need a time machine so I can go tell Terrence to fix this quote, but I'm going to use it anyway. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? It's what this country was founded on. We now know what happiness is. It's serotonin, norepinephrine, and dopamine in your brain. That's what happiness is. And if the right to pursue happiness doesn't include the right to directly modulate your own neurochemistry, those words are utterly meaningless. And so I really think this is, like I said earlier, this is a cognitive liberty fight. We need to integrate these messages that we've learned through both drug and non-drug induced psychedelics. And I think we're running low on time, but I don't think we're quite out yet. I think we still have a window where we might pull out of the tailspin. And so I'm really, really hopeful that psychedelics can help do that, and really hopeful that harm reduction can provide the tools that we need to sort of integrate these experiences into our culture. And we have no time for a Q&A, but I think there's a panel afterwards for Q&A. So the Q&A slide lives here, but let's not actually do it. But yeah, thank you guys so much. I've really enjoyed talking.